The massive hall on Nexus Prime was filled with creatures from across the galaxy, and Admiral Jake Harrison stood in the center circle where all eyes watched him, and his uniform was clean, but his face showed the weight of what was coming, and around him sat beings that looked like giant insects and others with scales that changed color, and some that floated in special tanks filled with strange gas, and all of them hated humanity. Chancellor Vextar was a tall reptile with green scales that turned red when he was angry, and right now they were very red, and he stood up from his high chair and pointed a clawed finger at Jake, and his voice echoed through the hall like thunder, and he said that humanity was guilty of being too violent, and taking planets that did not belong to them and breaking the peace that had lasted for thousands of years. Captain Lisa Rodriguez stepped forward, and she was the best diplomat Earth had ever sent to space, and her voice was calm, even though her heart was beating fast, and she told the council that humans had only fought when they were attacked first, and that every battle they fought was to protect their people and their homes, and that the other species had started the wars, not humanity. Insect Queen called Zarath made clicking sounds with her mouth parts, and her many eyes all looked at Lisa with disgust, and she said that humans were born violent, and that they even fought wars with each other on their own planet, and that the galaxy would never know peace while humans were free to travel the stars. And her voice sounded like breaking glass. Jake remembered the first time he had met aliens and how excited humanity had been to learn they were not alone in the universe, and how quickly that excitement had turned to fear when the first alien ships attacked human colonies without warning, and how humans had to learn to fight back or die. And now the same aliens who had attacked first were calling humans the violent. Once the vote happened quickly, and Jake watched as species after species voted to exile humanity from the galaxy, and only 7 species chose not to vote at all, and none voted to help humanity, except for one strange group called the Keepers, who nobody really understood and who had been watching the galaxy for longer than anyone could remember. Elder Keeper Morden looked like a human, but his skin was silver, and his eyes glowed with white light, and he spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and he told the council they were making a terrible mistake, and that humanity was not the problem, but the solution, and that they would learn this truth when it was too late to change their minds. The council did not listen to the Keeper, and within 3 days every human settlement outside the Sol system was being emptied, and millions of people had to leave their homes and their farms and their lives behind, and board ships that would take them back to Earth and the solar system that had been their cradle and would now become their prison. The Terran fleet was led by Jake's ship called the UES Liberty, and it was joined by hundreds of other human ships as they escorted the refugee vessels toward home, and Jake stood on his bridge and watched the barriers being built behind them, and the energy fields that would keep humanity trapped in their own solar system, like animals in a cage. Dr. Peter Collins was a scientist who studied alien life, and he stood next to his friend Dr. Amy Chen, watching the barriers come to life, and the energy made the space around Sol glow with strange colors. And he said quietly that the aliens thought they had locked up the monsters, but they had no idea what they had just done to themselves, and Amy nodded because she understood what he meant. The last human ship crossed into Sol space, and the barriers sealed shut with a sound like thunder that could be felt through the hull of every ship, and Jake knew that humanity was now alone again, just like they had been before they learned to travel between the stars, and he wondered if they would ever see the galaxy again. On Earth, the news of the exile spread quickly, and people gathered in the streets, and some cried while others shouted in anger. And President Marcus Webb spoke to the world from his office and told everyone that this was not the end, but a new beginning, and that humanity would survive and grow stronger, and that one day they would return to the stars. In the alien council chambers, the representatives were celebrating, and they believed they had solved the problem of human violence by simply removing humans from the equation, and they made plans to divide up the human colonies and take the resources that humans had found and mined and built their lives around. But Elder Keeper Morden did not celebrate, and instead he returned to his ship and sent a message to the other keepers scattered across the galaxy, and the message was simple and frightening, and it said that the Guardians had been removed, and that the ancient enemy would soon wake, and that the galaxy had doomed itself by exiling the only species that could save them. The barriers around Sol were designed to last forever, and they were powered by the energy of the sun itself, and no human ship could break through them, and no alien ship could enter. and humanity was truly alone for the first time in 50 years, and many people wondered if they would ever see aliens again. Jake Harrison stood in his quarters aboard the Liberty and looked at pictures of the colonies he had helped build and the alien friends he had made before the wars started, and he thought about his daughter Sarah, who was serving on another ship, and about the future that had been stolen from all of humanity. Outside his window, the barrier glowed softly, and beyond it lay a galaxy full of aliens who feared and hated humanity. And Jake made a promise to himself that somehow, and someday, humans would return to the stars, and when they did, the galaxy would remember why it had been afraid. 3 years had passed since the barriers went up around Sol, and humanity had not been sitting idle, and Commander Ryan Bradley floated in his spacesuit among the asteroids where the biggest construction project in human history was taking place. And all around him, robots and workers were building ships that were unlike anything humans had ever made before. The new ships were sleek and deadly, and they used technology that humans had stolen from alien wrecks and improved with human engineering. And Ryan told his chief engineer, Kate Morrison, that they were not just building a fleet but building the most powerful war machines the galaxy had ever seen. And Kate smiled because she knew he was right. Dr. Peter Collins had spent the 3 years studying every piece of alien technology humans had captured, and he had learned how to weaponize quantum physics in ways that would make alien scientists weep with terror. And his laboratory was filled with devices that could tear holes in space itself. And he worked 18 hours a day because he knew humanity would need every advantage. Dr. Amy Chen had developed new armor that could change its properties based on what kind of weapon was hitting it, and the armor could become harder than diamond or softer than silk depending on what it needed to do. And she had also created shield generators that could protect entire fleets from energy weapons. President Marcus Webb had moved the entire government to Luna City on the moon, and from there he coordinated the greatest military buildup in human history, and every factory on Earth and Mars and the space stations was working to build weapons and ships and supplies for the war that everyone knew was coming. Admiral Elena Vasquez commanded the intelligence division from her ship called the UES Defiance, and her job was to listen to alien communications and watch what was happening beyond the barriers, and what she heard made her worried because the galaxy was already starting to fall apart without humans to keep the balance. The Zephyrian Confederacy and the Draconis Empire were fighting over mining rights in space that used to belong to humans, and without human mercenary fleets to patrol the trade routes, pirates were attacking cargo ships, and the careful peace that had existed for centuries was breaking down. The Corvin Syndicate had always been barely controlled criminals, and now they were raiding Zilithian supply convoys and taking whatever they wanted, and the Zilithians were too proud to ask for help from the other species and too weak to stop the raids themselves. The Hive Queens were expanding their territory into neutral space and claiming planets that had been set aside for colonization by any species, and they said they needed more worlds for their growing population. But Elena knew they were just taking advantage of the chaos. The insect creatures had always been the most aggressive species in the Council, except for humans, and now without humans to fight, they were looking for new enemies and new territories, and their ships were moving toward the borders of other species, in formations that looked very much like invasion fleets. On Earth, the lunar factories were producing new fighters that could move faster than anything aliens had ever built, and the pilots training to fly them were the best humans had ever produced, and Lieutenant Sarah Harrison was one of them, and she was Admiral Jake Harrison's daughter, and she had inherited his skill for combat. Sarah spent her days practicing in simulators that recreated every known type of alien ship and weapon, and she learned how to fight Draconis heavy cruisers and Corvin stealth fighters and Zephyrian battle platforms, and she was very good at killing simulated aliens. The human colonies inside Sol system were growing rapidly as people worked to build new homes and new lives, and the asteroid belt was now filled with mining stations and construction yards and weapons. Platforms in the moons of Jupiter had become massive military bases. Commander Ryan Bradley's shipyards had produced over 300 new warships, and each one was equipped with weapons that could destroy alien vessels in ways the aliens could not understand or defend against. And the ships also carried human soldiers who had been trained to board alien vessels and fight in the corridors. Dr. Collins had discovered that quantum entanglement could be used to create weapons that ignored alien shields completely, and the weapons worked by making the target exist in two places at once until the target tore itself apart, and the effect was instantaneous across any distance. But the most important discovery was made by Dr. Amy Chen when she learned that human brains worked differently from alien brains, and that human thoughts were chaotic and unpredictable, while alien thoughts followed patterns. And this meant that humans could confuse alien computers and communications in ways that aliens could not defend against. Colonel Susan Hayes worked for President Webb, and her job was to analyze intelligence reports, and she had noticed something disturbing in the signals coming from the edge of the galaxy, and the signals were not from any known species, and they seemed to be getting stronger. The signals came from areas of space where no one lived, and where no ships ever went, and they were written in a language that was older than any known civilization. And when the best human linguists tried to translate them, they found words about harvest and reclamation and the return of something called the Devourers. Alina Vasquez brought these reports to Admiral Jake Harrison, and they met in secret aboard the Liberty. And Jake read the translations, and his face became very serious, and he asked Elena what she thought it meant, and she said she thought something was waking up. The Keepers had tried to send messages to humanity through the barriers, but the messages were blocked, and Jake wondered what Elder Keeper Morden had been trying to warn them about, and whether it had something to do with the strange signals from the edge of space. President Webb called a meeting of the Terran High Command, and everyone gathered in the war room on Luna, and they discussed the alien signals and the breakdown of galactic peace and the new weapons that humanity was building. And they all agreed that something big was coming. Jake Harrison stood before the assembled leaders and told them that humanity had been exiled from the galaxy, but the galaxy had not been protected from humanity, and that when the time came, humans would return to the stars, and this time, they would not ask permission. The barriers around Sol continued to glow with energy, and they kept humanity trapped, but they also kept humanity safe. And beyond them, the galaxy was slowly dissolving into chaos and war, and the ancient signals were getting stronger every day. Sarah Harrison finished her training and was assigned to command a squadron of the new fighters, and she knew that soon she would get her chance to show the galaxy what humans could do when they were truly angry and truly desperate and truly united. The mining station called Kethmore stopped answering messages from the Corvin homeworld, and at first nobody was worried because communication problems happened all the time in deep space. But when 3 days passed without any contact, the Corvin Syndicate sent a patrol ship to investigate. The patrol ship found Kethmore floating in space exactly where it should be, and all the lights were on, and the life support systems were working perfectly. But when the patrol team boarded the station, they found it completely empty, and 60,000 Corvin workers had simply vanished without leaving any trace. There were no signs of a fight, and no damage to the station, and no indication that anyone had left in escape pods, and the strangest thing was that meals were still sitting on tables in the cafeteria, and some of the food was still warm, as if the workers had just stepped away for a moment. The Corvin investigators searched every room and every corridor, but they found no bodies, and no blood and no clues about what had happened to the workers, and the security cameras showed normal activity, right up until the moment when everyone disappeared all at once. The second disappearance happened to the Zephyrian colony of New Arcturus, and this time, an entire planet with 4 million inhabitants went silent overnight, and the Zephyrian government immediately contacted the Galactic Council and demanded a full investigation. Supreme Commander Thexnal of the Draconis Empire led a fleet of 20 ships to New Arcturus, and what they found there made even the battle-hardened dragon warriors afraid, and the planet looked like it had been hit by weapons more powerful than anything in the known galaxy. The surface was covered with massive burn marks that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and the marks were perfectly circular, as if something had systematically carved up the planet like a piece of meat. And the cities were gone, and the forests were gone, and even the mountains had been melted down to slag. But the most frightening discovery was a series of metal objects floating in orbit around the planet, and they were obviously artificial, but they were not built by any known species, and they were broadcasting a message in a language that nobody recognized. Dr. Yeleth was the Council's expert on ancient languages, and she worked for days to translate even a small part of the message. And when she finally succeeded, the words she found made everyone in the council chamber afraid to sleep at night. The message said that the exile of the Guardians marked the beginning of reclamation, and that the harvest would now commence, and that all organic life in the galaxy would be collected and processed, and that resistance was not only futile but actually helpful, because fear made the harvest more efficient. Chancellor Vextar called an emergency session of the Galactic Council, and representatives from every species gathered on Nexus Prime to discuss. The crisis, and the reptilian leader's scales were pale with fear as he read the reports from New Arcturus. The Council voted to strengthen defenses around all major worlds and to create joint patrol fleets that would watch for signs of the mysterious enemy. But even as they made these plans, more colonies were disappearing and the rate was increasing. 7 more worlds went silent in the next 6 hours, and the pattern of disappearances formed a spiral that was moving inward toward the populated center of the galaxy, and whatever was causing the disappearances was getting closer to the major homeworlds. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had been promoted to Director of External Intelligence, and she worked from a secret facility on the dark side of Earth's moon, and her job was to monitor alien communications, and what she heard made her both frightened and grimly satisfied. The aliens were calling the attackers the Devourers, and they described them as ancient machines that consumed all organic matter and converted it into energy and materials to build more machines, and the descriptions reminded Lisa of old human legends about mechanical demons. The alien fleets that tried to fight the Devourers were destroyed easily, and the machines seemed to absorb energy weapons and turn destroyed ships into more copies of themselves, and they moved through space in ways that violated known physics. Admiral Jake Harrison studied the tactical reports that Lisa brought him, and he realized that the energy barriers around Sol were not just keeping humans in, but keeping something else out, and the massive power output from the barriers had probably awakened whatever was now destroying the galaxy. Lisa told Jake that the Keeper archives mentioned a previous invasion 5,000 years ago, when similar machines had nearly destroyed galactic civilization, and the invasion was stopped by a species that the Keepers called the Warrior Diplomats. Jake understood immediately what that meant, and he called President Webb and told him that humanity had not been exiled to protect the galaxy from humans, but to remove the only species that could protect the galaxy from something much worse. The Draconis Empire lasted 4 hours against the Devourer Swarm, and the proud dragon warriors who had ruled 100 worlds for 2,000 years were reduced to refugees fleeing in whatever ships could escape, and their homeworld was turned into a ball of molten metal. The Corvin Syndicate's advanced technology was useless against enemies that could phase in and out of normal space, and their stealth ships were detected and destroyed before they could even fire their weapons, and their criminal networks collapsed in a single day. The Insect Hive Queens tried to fight the Devourers with massive swarms of their warrior drones, but the machines simply absorbed the bioenergy from the insects and used it to power themselves, and entire hive worlds were consumed in minutes as each civilization fell. The survivors fled toward the center of the galaxy, and many of them gathered near the Sol barriers where they begged and pleaded for humanity to help them. But the barriers remained solid, and humanity stayed silent. Elder Keeper Morden brought his ancient ship to the Sol perimeter and broadcast messages explaining that the Devourers were not random destroyers, but a fail-safe system created by the first galactic civilization to eliminate species that became too peaceful to defend themselves. The Elder Keeper explained that the Devourers were designed to consume civilizations that had achieved perfect harmony and unity, because such civilizations could not adapt or evolve, and the machines were activated when the galaxy's warrior species were removed. But humanity had chaotic and unpredictable minds that the machines could not process properly, and human military tactics were too random and aggressive for the Devourer programming to counter. And this was why humans were the guardians that the Keepers had spoken of. Dr. Peter Collins analyzed the Keepers' data and confirmed that the Devourers were attracted to unified thought patterns and peaceful civilizations, but they had trouble with species that thought in chaotic and violent ways like humans did. President Webb faced the hardest decision in human history because billions of innocent beings were dying beyond the barriers, but the same beings had voted to exile humanity, and many humans wanted to let them all die for what they had done. General Frank Turner argued that humanity should stay hidden and let the galaxy burn. But Dr. Amy Chen argued that saving innocent lives was more important than revenge, and the debate raged for hours while more worlds died. The choice came down to whether humanity's desire for justice was worth allowing the extinction of galactic civilization, and Webb knew that whatever he decided would define what kind of species humanity really was. The mighty fleets of the Galactic Council crumbled before the Devourer advanced like paper ships in a hurricane, and the machines were massive constructs the size of cities that seemed to exist partially outside normal space and time, and they could appear and disappear at will. The Devourers absorbed every energy weapon fired at them, and they converted destroyed alien ships into materials to build more of their kind, and every battle made them stronger while making their enemies weaker, and the alien military leaders had no answer for this nightmare. The proud Draconis Empire had ruled the galaxy for centuries with their massive battleships and their warrior traditions, but their entire fleet was destroyed in 4 hours when they tried to make a stand at their fortress world of Drakmor, and the dragon warriors died bravely but uselessly. The technologically advanced Corvin Syndicate believed their superior science would give them an advantage, and they deployed weapons that could destroy planets and shields that could stop stars. But the Devourers simply phased through their defenses and absorbed their technology. Within 6 months, 12 major civilizations had fallen to the machines, and billions of beings were dead, or missing, and the survivors fled toward the galactic center in refugee fleets that grew smaller every day as the Devourers hunted them down. The Zephyrian Confederacy tried to hide their remaining population in the asteroid fields of their outer systems, but the Devourers found them anyway and consumed entire asteroid colonies in minutes, and the Zephyrians, who had once been proud traders, became homeless wanderers. The insect hive queens, who had always been the most aggressive species after humans, discovered that their warrior instincts meant nothing against enemies that could not be intimidated or reasoned with, and their hive worlds burned one by one. In the ruins of the council chambers on Nexus Prime, Chancellor Vextar lay dying from wounds inflicted by Devourer scouts, and his final words were transmitted across the galaxy on emergency frequencies, and he said that they had been wrong, and that they needed humanity. But the barriers around Sol still held, and humanity remained, cut off from the galaxy, and the desperate alien survivors who gathered at the Sol perimeter found that their former enemies would not answer their calls for help. Refugee ships from dozens of species crowded against the energy barriers, and their communications filled every frequency with pleas for mercy and assistance, and many of the messages came from the same beings who had voted to exile humanity just 3 years earlier. Admiral Jake Harrison stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty and watched the alien ships pressing against the barrier like moths against a window, and his daughter, Lieutenant Sarah Harrison, served as his communications officer, and she translated the desperate messages. Sarah told her father that there were children on the refugee ships and that whatever their governments had done to humanity, the civilians did not deserve to die, and Jake agreed, but he said that orders from Earth Command were clear, and no one could enter Sol until certain conditions were met. The conditions were simple but humiliating for the proud alien species, and they required a formal apology from the surviving government leaders and recognition of human sovereignty over all former human colonies, and acceptance of human leadership in any future galactic government. Elderkeeper Morden brought his ancient ship to the barrier and broadcast on all frequencies trying to reach Admiral Harrison, and he explained that the Devourers were not random destroyers, but a fail-safe created by the first galactic civilization. The Elderkeeper said that the machines were designed to eliminate species that grew too peaceful and unified to defend themselves, and that the Devourers were drawn to large concentrations of harmonious thought patterns but could not process chaotic aggressive minds like humans possessed. Dr. Peter Collins now headed the Terran Defense Research Division, and he presented his findings to the War Council and confirmed that the Devourers were programmed to consume passive civilizations but had trouble with violent, unpredictable species. The machines used advanced algorithms to predict enemy behavior, and they were designed to counter the tactics used by peaceful united civilizations, but human military doctrine was too random and chaotic for their programming to handle effectively. President Marcus Webb faced the hardest decision in human history, and the barriers could hold indefinitely, but billions of innocent beings were dying beyond them, and his advisors were divided on what to do. General Frank Turner led the military faction that argued for maintaining isolation, and he said that humanity owed nothing to the species that had exiled them, and that Earth should let the galaxy burn and rebuild civilization with human values. Dr. Amy Chen headed the Humanitarian Council, and she argued for immediate intervention. And she said that humanity's greatest strength was not their ability to fight, but their refusal to abandon the innocent, even when those innocents had wronged them. The debate raged for days while more alien worlds fell to the devourers, and President Webb listened to arguments from both sides, and he read reports about the machine advance, and he struggled with the weight of deciding the fate of galactic civilization. The military leaders pointed out that humanity had tried to warn the other species about various threats over the years, but had been ignored and dismissed, and now the same species that had refused to listen were begging for help. The humanitarian leaders argued that children and innocents were dying for the mistakes of their governments, and that humanity should be better than their former enemies, and should save lives regardless of politics. Webb knew that whatever decision he made would define humanity's character for generations to come, and would determine whether humans were seen as saviors or as vengeful isolationists, and the choice would echo through history. The devourers continued. Their advance and more refugee ships arrived at the Sol barrier every hour, and some of the alien commanders tried to force their way through the energy fields, but their ships were simply destroyed by the defensive systems. Admiral Elena Vasquez monitored the situation from her command ship, and she reported that the machine swarms were now only weeks away from reaching the core worlds where most of the galaxy's population lived. The Keeper archives revealed that the previous Devourer invasion, 5,000 years ago, had been stopped only when a warrior species had sacrificed themselves to destroy the machine control centers, and that species had been wiped out in the process. Sarah Harrison flew patrol missions along the barrier, and she could see the alien refugee ships crowding against the energy fields, and she could hear their desperate communications, and she wondered if humanity would really let them all die. The final decision came when President Webb received a personal message from a Zilithian child who had learned human language, and the child asked why the humans who had once protected alien colonies were now hiding, while everyone died. Webb realized that humanity's greatest victory would not come from defeating their enemies, but from proving that they were better than their enemies, and that justice tempered with mercy was stronger than revenge. President Marcus Webb stood before the cameras in the Terran Federation headquarters on Luna, and his address was broadcast simultaneously to Earth and Mars and the space stations, and to the desperate refugee fleets beyond the barrier, and his words would change the course of galactic history. Webb said that humanity was not a species that abandoned the innocent, no matter what their governments had done, and that humanity was also not foolish enough to repeat past mistakes, and that the galaxy would be saved, but it would be saved on human terms. The energy barriers around Sol began to flicker and fade 12 hours later. But instead of a rescue fleet emerging, the aliens saw something they had never witnessed before, and that was diplomats backed by the most powerful military force ever assembled by any species. Admiral Jake Harrison's armada was a sight that made even the bravest alien warriors tremble, and 500 quantum-class dreadnoughts emerged from Sol space, and each ship was capable of matching an entire pre-war battle fleet, and they moved in perfect formation. But the most important thing humanity brought was something the aliens had never possessed, and that was the ability to be simultaneously compassionate and ruthless, and to show mercy while demanding justice, and to save lives while reshaping the political order. Captain Dan Sullivan commanded the first engagement against a devourer swarm that was threatening the Zilithian homeworld, and his ship was called the UES Redemption, and it carried weapons that used Dr. Collins' quantum chaos generators to overload machine processing networks. The Devourers had been designed to handle the predictable tactics of unified civilizations, but they simply could not adapt to humanity's chaotic military doctrine, and Sullivan's orders were to confuse the machines rather than simply destroy them. Sullivan broadcast to his fleet and told them to remember that they were not there to destroy the Devourers, but to make them think humans were completely insane, and he ordered random firing patterns and unpredictable movements and psychological warfare. The battle was won in 37 minutes when the Devourer swarm's collective intelligence suffered a cascade failure trying to process human tactical decisions, and the machines began attacking each other and finally shut down completely. Across the galaxy, human fleets appeared wherever devourers threatened populated worlds, and the human ships used tactics that violated every principle of rational warfare, and the machines could not cope with enemies who seemed to enjoy being unpredictable. Captain Ryan Bradley led the defense of the Corvin refugee fleet, and his ships used Dr. Chen's adaptive E armor to survive devourer energy weapons while firing quantum entanglement torpedoes that made the machines exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The devourers tried to absorb the human weapons, but the quantum effects caused feedback loops that destroyed their processing cores, and Bradley's pilots flew their fighters in patterns that looked random but were actually based on human music. And poetry, Admiral Sarah Harrison took command of the assault on the largest devourer construct, and her fleet attacked the city-sized machine using tactics based on her father's old combat reports, and the machine's defenses were overwhelmed by pure human stubbornness. The construct tried to phase out of normal space to escape, but Sarah's ships followed it using experimental dimensional drives, and the battle continued across multiple realities until the machine finally surrendered and asked to negotiate. But humanity's price for salvation was steep and completely non-negotiable, and the surviving alien governments had to accept total governmental reform and recognition of human territorial claims, and most importantly, human representation in all future galactic decisions. Chancellor Vextar's successor was a humbled Zilithian named Morkes, and he signed the new Galactic Compact in a simple ceremony aboard Admiral Harrison's flagship, and his scales were dim with shame as he admitted their mistakes. Morkes said that they understood now that peace without strength was merely an invitation to destruction, and that harmony without the willingness to fight for it was just another form of weakness, and that humanity would never again be exiled from the stars. Dr. Amy Chen became Earth's first galactic ambassador, and she established the new protocols that would govern interspecies relations, and every species would contribute to the common defense, and every species would have a voice in their collective future. The new government was based on human concepts of democracy and individual rights, but it also incorporated the best elements of alien cultures, and the result was a federation that was stronger than the sum of its parts. Admiral Elena Vasquez was placed in charge of the new galactic defense force, and she began training mixed-species crews to use human tactics and alien technology, and the combination proved to be devastatingly effective. The last devourer was destroyed above the ruins of Nexus Prime exactly 1 year after humanity's return, and as the machine's death scream echoed across subspace, Elder Keeper Morden sent his final message to every world in the galaxy. The Elder Keeper said that the Guardians had returned, and that the galaxy was safe, not because humanity was violent, but because they understood that some things were worth fighting for, and that they knew the difference between a warrior and a butcher. He explained that humanity's strength came from their refusal to surrender, and their willingness to sacrifice for others, and their ability to be gentle with the weak and fierce with the strong, and that these qualities made them natural leaders. Admiral Jake Harrison was promoted to Supreme Commander of the Galactic Defense Force, and he stood on the bridge of his new flagship called the UES New Horizon, and watched construction crews building monuments to remember those who had died. The Memorial of the Fallen was built in orbit around Nexus Prime, and it honored every being who had died during the Devourer War regardless of species, and it served as a reminder that freedom and peace required constant vigilance. Sarah Harrison was promoted to Admiral and given command of the new Multi-Species Academy, where young beings from across the galaxy learned human military tactics and alien sciences and formed friendships that would prevent future wars. The galaxy began to rebuild under human leadership, and the new colonies were designed with defense in mind, and every world had the ability to protect itself and call for help, and no species would ever again face extinction alone. Dr. Peter Collins continued his research into quantum weapons and dimensional technology, and his discoveries led to advances that made galactic travel safer and faster and opened up entirely new areas of space for exploration. The former human colonies were returned to human control, but they were also opened to settlement by other species, and the result was mixed communities that combined the best of human and alien cultures. President Webb was elected as the first president of the Galactic Federation, and he established his capital on a new world called Unity that was built specifically to house the multi-species government and to serve as a symbol of cooperation. Jake Harrison often stood on his bridge and looked out at the stars and remembered the day when humanity had been exiled, and he thought about how far they had all come and about the lessons that had been learned. His daughter, Sarah, joined him at the viewport and asked if he thought the other species would remember the lessons of the Devourer War, and Jake smiled and said they would remember for a generation or two before they started to forget. He said that then humanity would have to remind them again, and that this was the human way and that humans did not stay angry forever, but they never forgot who they were or what they stood for. The galaxy was safe and protected by the species it had once feared, and humanity had proven that strength and compassion could coexist, and that the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from making them into friends.